Good evening and welcome everyone to tonight's virtual educational program, The Family as the Foundation, Empowering Caregivers in Autism and Behavioral Interventions. My name is Michael Morrier and I'm the program chair of the Atlanta Autism Consortium. And the AAC is a nonprofit organization dedicated to creating collaboration and conversations throughout the Metro Atlanta autism community and beyond. Throughout the year, we host free educational programs just like this one on a wide variety of topics. And the entire AAC Board of Directors are so glad that you've all joined us tonight. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping notes. Please note that as an attendee, your microphone and camera will remain muted, but you can ask questions you have throughout the program in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. Additionally, this session is being recorded and will be posted on the AAC's YouTube channel in a few weeks. We'll be emailing out notification when that is available, as well as contact information for our panelists to the email address you use to register for the program, so that if you have additional questions that don't get answered tonight, you can contact them directly. Tonight, we are joined by the AAC's co-chair emeritus and current chair of board development, Dr. Nuhu. Dr. Nuhu and members of our organization will be providing us a lot of useful information on how to include family members as meaningful participants with their autistic individuals' treatment and support. I'm now going to turn it over to Dr. Nuhu, who will moderate this great panel for us tonight.
Wonderful. Thank you. So thank you all for joining us today. This is one of the topics that I would consider to be of great importance, but doesn't get the attention that I think it deserves. Really kind of thinking about the families that we serve and how to best support them outside of the behavioral interventions that we're implementing with them. So the way that we're going to kind of shape this panel is I'm going to start off with kind of sharing some like very brief pilot data on some data that I collected on some cases that we have. And then after that, we have some questions that we're going to start off with answering that we think might be relevant to this topic, but then really open it up to you guys to kind of ask us additional questions and really kind of have a discussion about this topic. So I'm not tech savvy, but I think I can share a screen. So I'm going to try to share my PowerPoint. Everyone see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Yes, awesome. Okay, great. I did it. Okay, so when when really thinking about behavior analytic services for individuals diagnosed with autism, we know that we have effective interventions. We know that we have treatments that are going to be able to take a family from point A to point B based on what their personal goals are for their child and for their family system. But there are some pieces that we don't necessarily have a good understanding of. But we do see that within our practice, oh, well, this intervention works really well, but for some reason, we're not making the treatment gains that we want to make. And what we are going to be talking about today are some of like the other variables that are impacting that are really at the root of some of the delays in treatment progress and are really at the root of some of the concerns that our families might be dealing with that are impacting their success. To be able to do that, I want us to kind of be under the same model and same framework of understanding. So I wanted to talk about social determinants of health. So these are conditions in the environment where people are born, where they live, where they work, and how those environments impact their health, their functioning, and their quality of life. So what the literature kind of shows, the behavioral health literature shows, is that while medical care accounts for about 10 to 20% of a person's overall health outcome, right? Social determinants of health account for about 80 to 90% of contributing factors. So that means that you can have two people and they can have two similar diagnoses, but depending on their social determinants of health, one person is at an increased likelihood of having better outcomes than another person, which I think is pretty major and important for us to really be considering in our clinical work. So these are the social determinants of health. So we have healthcare and access and quality. So this is thinking about like types of medical insurance that the person has, their ability to be able to access, medical care when it's needed, being able to see the provider that you need to see, being able to see them as often as you need to be able to see them. And then we have economic stability. So this is looking at housing stability, employment, like how the financial resources of the individual and the people within their community. Social and community context, this talks about the person's engagement within their community. So the level of trust that they have within their community, how comfortable do they feel that their community is going to take care of them in times of difficulty? Neighborhood and built environment. So this is also kind of looking at quality of the housing, right? So do you have housing that can withstand natural disasters, or housing where you feel safe to be able to be outside, or you feel safe to be in your home? And also things like transportation. How well are you able to access other communities or other environments within your community? Can you get to work? Can you get to school? Things like that. So the data that I'm going to show you guys are data from a complex behavior unit, really focused on reducing challenging behaviors that individuals with autism spectrum disorder that are diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder engage in. So what we know about those type of treatment programs is that treatments developed based on the function of challenging behavior are more effective. So if you know why problem behavior is happening, then you're going to be more able to implement a treatment that's effective for it. And then we also know that early intervention is preferred when possible. So the earlier that you can target a behavior that's causing the individual difficulties, the better chances you're going to be successful in treating it. But there's a lot of things that we don't know. We don't know about the non-function based variables that act as moderators of success. And we also don't really have a clear understanding of how family characteristics impact treatment effectiveness. So this study that I'm going to be talking about is starting to gather preliminary data to help inform next steps in other studies. So what we did is we took child demographics and family demographics and really just kind of started looking at any differences. We divided the group that we had into those who had successful treatment and who had a successful treatment admission, and those who were unsuccessful. And we defined that as them meeting 50% or more of their caregiver goals during the admission, and them having a reduction in challenging behavior within the community setting. These are just preliminary data. It's a very small sample size. It's 10 cases. We looked at the last 5 successful cases and compared them to the last 5 unsuccessful cases. So concurrently, the last 5 were selected and the last for each groups. So here are some of our outcomes. I'm going to go through this quickly, mostly because the purpose of this panel is for us to kind of discuss what are things that providers can do, what are things that parents can ask for. But I think these data really kind of help emphasize the importance of it. So in this sample, there was really no difference between those who had a functional analysis and those who did not. So I kind of told you guys that that's one thing that we know, that if you know why a behavior is happening, you're going to be more successful in being able to treat it. So here we're saying that for both groups, we were able to tell why problem behavior was happening. For our sample, everyone was male, so there was no difference there. The age of our sample, for those who were successful, the average age was about 16 years old compared to those who were unsuccessful, which is interesting given the fact that we would expect that it's more difficult to treat behavior that's been happening for a long time as opposed to behavior that has not been happening as long. But even with that, they're both within the adolescent group, not much difference there. And then looking at their cognitive functioning level, we did find that overall, both groups were functioning at what we would classify the borderline or extremely low category of functioning. So no one was necessarily in the average or above average categories of cognitive functioning. So the groups cognitively were similar. Same with adaptive functioning. We found that both groups were at the lower range of adaptive functioning. So far they're kind of very similar. Now I'm kind of getting into a little bit more of the differences between the successful group and the unsuccessful group. We found that people that were in the successful group had access to more caregivers in the home. So about 100% of the people in the unsuccessful group had about 2 or more caregivers that were available to help with treatment versus the unsuccessful group, where most of the caregivers were either 2 or 1 caregiver in the home. Reliable transportation. So we found that in our successful group, everyone had reliable transportation. As to our unsuccessful group, where only 60% had access to reliable transportation. Stable housing. So 100% of our group in the successful group had stable housing versus 80% not having stable housing in our unsuccessful group. So we're starting to see some major differences here. Insurance provider, we found that 80% of our successful group had private insurance versus only 20% in our unsuccessful group having private insurance. And in looking at our unsuccessful group, the reasons for discharge really included transportation, housing instability, not being able to afford to access the care because the care was only available in a different state, caregivers failing health, and then one individual not being able to access the medical care to address his seizure disorder, which then resulted in him having to be discharged from the program because he continued to have seizures during treatment, which really just impacted not only his safety, but his progress and being able to make the treatment gains that he was looking for. So what these data really show us, one, keep in mind, very small sample size, but what they show us is that there might be more room in considering social determinants of health when you are providing care to your families, because they may actually play more of a major role for our families than what we would typically assume. So it's not enough to really have our treatment interventions or procedures in place, but we really got to look at the family unit and make sure that the family unit is having access to what they need to be able to support the client that we're working with. So now I'm going to jump into the questions. I'm going to take this off of share, but I'll read the questions as we go. Any questions so far before I kind of jump into our questions? I haven't been looking at the...
No,
Um,
oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, would it be helpful for me to paste the question into the chat as you go?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay.
I just wanted us to be able to see our faces more as we talked. Okay, so the first question that we have is, why is the family considered the foundation of behavior intervention? Um,
I can start. That
Great.
work? Um, so I think a broad answer I would say is why, as a behavior analyst or anyone working with, this population, that you want to think of the family as foundation is because that's who is primarily with this child or adult, whoever you're serving, right? So they know your client the best, more than their teachers, more than whoever is that primary caregiver, most likely, situation dependent, knows that client the best. And so when you're thinking about all of the different little facets of behavior intervention, your best resource for information and background information of, okay, can you fill me in on the last, 13 years of this kid's life and things that might have impacted these behaviors is the family. And without that information, then it kind of like going off what you said, can maybe really significantly impact the effectiveness of that intervention that you make. Yeah.
I would also add to that, they're the group of individuals that are with the client most frequently. So we're in 40 hours of school a week, more or less. But we are at home so much more than that, even counting those sleeping hours. When the child wakes, they're seeking out their caregivers in the home in the middle of the night. When they wake up, those are the people that are there. When they're going to bed, those are the people that are there. So they are the ones that have the most access to the child and who the child has the most access to as well.
Yeah. Well, and thinking about our long-term success with the family, depending on your treatment goals, we're going to be with the family for a period of time. The family system is who is going to be responsible for training other providers or training other teachers or caregivers to really be able to keep the intervention in place. So if they don't have the support they need to accomplish that, then really what we're looking at are short-term goals versus the longer-term impact that we want to have. Okay. So the next question is, I would like each of our panelists to kind of go through and talk through their approach to providing clinical care to their clients and how they integrate the family system into that.
I'll start. So for me, I try to always make sure that my plan is individualized for that client. I like to interview the parent and ask them like, what are your main goals for your kid? Like, what are you expecting from ABA? kind of trying to figure out what are those things that you want from this. I always try to always like also add like their culture is something to take into account. So different clients expect different things or looking for different things, such as going to church or maybe like taking your shoes off in the house or being able to eat at the table with a fork versus not having to do those things.
Yeah, so a very individualized approach to identifying relevant treatment goals for the family. And I think that is one thing to really emphasize when it comes to what caregivers can do as they're working with providers to help support their child with autism is really making sure that the goals that are being selected are reflective of what's really going to help their family system excel. Because sometimes, if giving your church example, if one of the things that helps the family feel that they are being supported and comforted is being within their community at a place like church, then the goal of being able to sit through a church service may be one that's very relevant to the family and one that's high priority because it allows mom to fill her tank of needs so then she's better able to care for her child. But if that's a goal that's not necessarily valued as highly, then it may not be attended to as quickly, but then it's going to be difficult for mom to participate in caregiver meetings. It's going to be difficult for mom to participate in caregiver trainings or to kind of help facilitate conversation between the provider and teacher. So there's a lot that's required of parents. So if we are not able to kind of, not, it's not all our responsibility, but if we're not able to at least take into consideration in developing these interventions, we're going to get ourselves into a place where we're fighting a lot of other battles that could have been really taken care of by helping the family actually be able to achieve goals that help their system and help their foundation. And Helen, of course.
I was gonna say, I agree. I think something that I really, take into consideration when starting clinical care with a client is really building rapport with that family, caregivers, whoever it might be, that's that primary point person before getting into the nitty-gritty with these families, right? Sometimes starting services can be scary for families. Maybe they haven't had good experiences other places or whatever that might look like. And I think it's really important as much as you can to build that rapport with them before you get too into the weeds of, okay, I need you to do this intervention right now, like this, or else this isn't going to work. I think that's where sometimes parents feel a little bit, at least in my experience, like, whoa, this is kind of a lot. And I think it's important to kind of build those relationships before you get to that point with them. Um, I also think that the other thing I think kind of bouncing off of Carol a little bit too is again those long-term goals for the client. For example, like if you have an early intervention client and they're like, okay, I want them to be able to go to school. Great. What interventions can I start putting in now that will eventually generalize well into that setting? Because, the world's, especially if I'm thinking that early intervention example, like the world's not an ABA clinic, right? School and all of that's very different. So those things that we might be able to easily do in clinic might not generalize those other settings like the home or school. And so I think those long-term goals of like, where do I want my kid to be in a year or two post-treatment, I think are really important to get from caregivers when you start off that care.
Agree.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you said one of my primary goals when I'm thinking about caregiver coaching, which is, of course, building rapport. I think sometimes we give a backseat to that because we're the professionals and we know everything about or a lot of things about our area of study, but it is really important to get to know the caregiver. It allows us to then get to know the client through their eyes. It allows us to build up that trust, which once that trust is built up, it's important not to take that lightly. I think the other thing that I include in my practice is making sure, building upon that rapport, making sure that you're bringing those caregivers in to intervention as early as you can. Now, there are some cases where, especially when we're dealing with complex behavior, we want to be sure that we have an established program that works, especially if it's got lots of little pieces that a caregiver is going to have to master each of those. And I'm sure that's something we'll talk about later, the different parts of treatment that we include. But starting that might be a case where I pull them in a little bit later, but we could still be talking about the ABCs of ABA and bringing them in. And I think the earlier we can bring them in, start educating them and build in that buy-in to what we're bringing to the table, the better. And if you're talking about skill acquisition, they're, as I mentioned earlier, they're the ones that are with that client the most, that have the most opportunities for learning and enriching their environment. Sooner we can bring them into caregiver and a caregiver coaching model, the sooner they can start helping to intervene with their client at the same level that we are. So bringing them in as early in as possible into the treatment would be a step that I like to take.
Yeah. And we're going to save, I think, a huge chunk of the questions for the end, but as they pop up, if they're specific to what we're talking about right now, I will kind of bring them up. And one of the questions fits well with kind of my response for how I approach my clinical care. So since social determinants of health are so important, we try to tie that in really at every stage of the care that we provide a family. So like at intake, we're definitely asking about what are your targets, what are your goals. We're really assessing your client or the person that's presenting to us as a client. What are their functioning levels? What are things that we can improve upon? What are things that are strengths that we can build upon? We're doing all of that, but we're also doing an informal barrier analysis, which I think kind of fits into social determinants of health. So if services are going to be provided at the clinic, the question is, are you able to get to the clinic? Are you able to, if services are being provided in the home, let's talk about how the home is set up. Is there a space in the home for us to be able to provide services? Are there any barriers to caregivers being able to get their child to services or to be in the home with the child with services? Our whole goal as we're providing services to families is to get them to that next level of functioning, to get them to that next level of success for their family. So we have to look about the behaviors, we have to look at what treatment is supposed to be, but also what are the things that are threats to that? What are the barriers that are threats to that? So we may have a family that doesn't have access to transportation. What we've tried to do is implement strategies to kind of help improve that. So can we have sessions at home even if they were supposed to be in the clinic? Or is there a way for us to help you get access to Medicaid transportation to be able to get you, if you have Medicaid insurance, to be able to get you to point A or point B? So we're problem solving with families. And I think what's really helpful, depending on the family that we're working with, is that problem solving in itself is a skill, right? So a lot of the time when you have a child that has a special need, or a child that has a lot of doctor's appointments, or that has a lot of additional meetings that you have to attend, all of that gets very overwhelming. All of that becomes a task that is really challenging to be able to navigate through your day. Having someone that can help you learn processes to problem solve as things come up, that in itself is something that parents can carry through in supporting their child, because it's not going to end at 4 years old. This is something that's going to be ongoing. It's going to be shifting, but it's a skill that they can use as they go forward. So my approach to clinical care is looking at the family not as just the client, but looking at the family unit, is really trying to focus in on, even if the goal is very specific to the client's behavior, who are the people that are going to support that goal? Who are the people that are going to make sure treatment's in place, and making sure they have buy-in, making sure that I have good rapport with them so they can tell me when they don't have buy-in. That's another reason why rapport is so good, because you want your families to be able to say, hey, I hear you, this is a critical skill, but that's not where we are right now. Where we are right now is that we really need to focus on this. And parents struggle to say that. That is a challenging thing, to look at a provider who you have brought on to help and say, hey, I don't agree with you. But having that good rapport allows for those type of important conversations to happen. So building rapport, I think, is something that we don't always talk about, but I think that most clinicians, and definitely everyone on this team, understands is really, really, really key to being able to make the behavior change that we want.
Okay, and you may be getting to this in one of your questions later on, but some of the questions kind of in the chat are centering around, like you're talking it sounds like mostly younger kids, but like what
Mhm.
about the whole kind of like age range or like with adults and we're like what is the
Yeah,
family or what about dads? Because we tend to focus more on moms, but like
yeah,
does any of these strategies you've talked about so far change if you're talking about a dad versus, a mom
yeah,
versus, an individual with autism themselves who,
yeah.
is going in?
That's an excellent question. I'll take a stab at it and then I'll pass it on to my co-panelist. So in thinking about, I'll start first with dads and then I'll move to talk about how these some of these things that we're saying apply to like the overall age ranges that we work with at least, which goes into adulthood. Is that start with dads. We're talking about both moms and dads. I think that one thing I will acknowledge in my practice is that the pattern that I see a lot of is that moms become like the go-to parent, even if that's not something they're selecting, and that's something that is isn't effective. So like in the data that I showed, one of the key factors that was different is access to multiple caregivers, right? So if we have a situation where only one caregiver, let's say it's mom, only mom is actively participating in caregiver meetings, only mom is actively participating in caregiver training, what we have set mom up for is that she's the person that everyone's going to continue to go to moving forward. She is now the only person responsible for this child's behavioral intervention, and that's not fair, right? And that's also what we know not effective because mom is going to get tired, mom's going to get overwhelmed, mom's going to get burned out. So how do we bring other sources of support? That may mean bringing in dad. What does that look like? Depending on the family, it may look different. We've noticed this pattern of it really falling on the mom, but then I think it becomes the provider's responsibility to set up rules. I need both parents at caregiver meeting. Okay, well, you know what? I talked to mom at caregiver meeting today, but I need to talk with dad at caregiver meeting next week. If dad's unable to make that appointment, then we need to find a time that works for dad. We need to make it a requirement for the other caregiver to participate in the sessions as opposed to just whoever shows up, which most of the time, at least in my practice, ends up being, if a mom is present, ends up being the mom. We really have to kind of put that burden of responsibility on other caregivers. And it may not just be dad, it may be grandparents, it may be aunts, it may be uncles, but if the primary caregiver is able to get support from other family members, we are seeing a lot more success and treatment being able to maintain past them just seeing us. Now, if you guys want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I would just say, I think then we can kind of force that hand by making sure our goals, when we're BCBA, writing goals for insurance approval or for in an IEP for school approval. IEP is a little different, but making sure that we're requiring generalization across to adults. So that way we're not going to be able to continue to provide this level of support if you're not able to have both present. That being said, to circle back to what you were saying about social determinants of health, identifying, it's also important that we not just say you have to be here, and if you're not here, we're not going to provide services. Why aren't you able to be here? Is it that there's an issue with transportation, or is it an issue with job hours? Okay, then I need to make myself available or work with another member of my team or in my community to provide that training at a time that you can be there, or provide it in a community center rather than in the home if that is something that you can't access. So, help building up that problem solving skill of how can we make this not a barrier. Something that's really important when you're thinking about pulling in multiple caregivers, and something I really think we need to be thinking very carefully about from your point, Dr. Nuhu.
Yeah.
Sorry, and since you brought up schools, there's a question about like when you look at post high school clients, what is, your experience with the school districts specifically related to kind of the lack of specificity of goals? And do you think that leads to kind of unrealistic evaluations and expectations about your clients' post high school goals? And then kind of a secondary part of that, which wasn't related to schools necessarily, but how do you deal with enmeshment between primary caregivers and the clients? Kind of two separate things there.
Yeah. Um, Anna Helen, were you going to add something about incorporating other caregivers, including dads, into treatment? And then
I
I'll.
had something very short, but if we want to move on, it's not. We
No, it's
can.
okay. Go ahead and say it.
I was just saying, I think kind of bounce what you guys said, like I think that flexibility is really important and kind of going off of that building rapport, like creating essentially like a safe space for whoever that may need that primary point person is to express to you maybe why this other individual is not participating in these meetings or doesn't want to or can't. Because sometimes it might be things that they don't typically maybe want to talk about if there's again transportation issues or maybe a work issue or maybe they don't fully buy into services and they don't know how to navigate that. I think that's something I have seen before. And so, I think creating with that rapport, creating that safe space for that primary person to feel comfortable sharing these things with you and not being judged is really important to then ultimately get those other caregivers involved in treatment.
Yeah, no, I agree. Uh, so that two-part question that you presented, I'm going to answer the enmeshment piece first because I think that also ties to the other question about how do these like suggestions apply to the wider age range. As you start working with adults, it does get more complicated, obviously, uh, for a couple of reasons. One being that you're dealing with family systems that have been fully kind of developed and realized. You're dealing with dynamics that are kind of already preset. So when you're coming in and you're trying to meet the goals of the family, you are in a situation where you're not undoing, but depending on the goal, you're trying to kind of potentially change a way of being that has been in place. Even if it hasn't been successful, it's been in place for several years. So one thing that we really want to do when I'm working with adults is, depending on the target client's actual communication level, is bring them in. So even if they don't necessarily have the back and forth ability to kind of communicate back and forth, I still bring them in. We still find ways to make sure that their voice and their goals are being worked on and they're able to have choices to the level that they're able to express them. And we work really hard to make sure that is true. When it comes to the family system, however, it's a balancing act, and that's an excellent question about enmeshment between primary caregiver and clients, because there is something that's supposed to happen developmentally that does not happen always with the clients that we serve. So developmentally, those like teenage years are actually fitting a purpose. They are preparing parents, honestly, for that ultimate like breakup, for that ultimate separation. It's not a real breakup, but it is kind of a change in that relationship where you are changing your roles within the family and you are learning how to communicate and how to be together in a way that kind of allows for both people to be making choices and that allows for people's choices not to align, right? And I think that when we think about our population, that important developmental stage doesn't always happen, but it doesn't mean that the desire to be independent from your primary caregivers isn't there. It doesn't mean that the desire to make your own choices, even if they don't align with your primary caregivers, isn't there. So what we really work hard to do is to kind of balance that out. What I found that if I keep it very goal centered, so goal of the parent, of the caregiver, goals of the individual that I'm working with directly, a lot of the times the goals may be stated differently, but there is some level of agreement between them. Because most of the time, parents also want them to live the most independent version of their lives that they can. Most of the time, parents and caregivers also want them to be able to access the communities that they want to be a part of or the relationship that they want to have. So if we can keep that final goal in mind, then it's about what is the roadmap to get you there. And that roadmap may look different, but if I can keep that goal, like the goal is independent living. Okay. So what I'm hearing from you is that it's really hard for you to let them take an Uber to the party at the Emory Autism Center. But let's talk through that. What are the concerns and barriers to kind of help parents kind of understand, okay, there's this, I have to let go because my ultimate goal is independence. There's no way to get there unless we take these little goals. And the same thing for the client. So your parents are really struggling with the Uber. What's an in-between step that we can take that also gets us to that same goal? It's not realistic, in my clinical opinion, to expect that the families that we work with, especially if the individual is still very, very reliant on caregivers, for them not to be involved in treatment. I think that we have to find a way to work with both groups to be able to reach those goals, because it isn't realistic for them to have a full on, well, now I'm never talking with you again. Unless there's obviously a case of abuse or a case of concern of safety. Outside of that, if they are a family that is caring and that wants the best and is trying to do the best, then finding a way to help them communicate and get to the end goal is really kind of, I think, the best way I've found to approach it. And usually if we can tie that to a goal that everyone kind of agrees to, we're able to make progress and compromise in other ways. Um, I hope that kind of answered the question. Anything you guys would like to add to that? No? Okay. I'll let someone else take on the question of post-high school clients and kind of thinking about the lack of specificity with goals and how that may lead to unrealistic evaluations and expectations after high school.
I think I can touch on this a little bit. I think I have definitely seen in school systems, personal experience and also professional experience where older clients or older individuals start to kind of get a little bit looked over, I feel like, with their goals and their, treatment essentially in schools. And I think that is a really big barrier with some school settings. Obviously, lots of our clients can stay until they're 22 years old. And so they've got those extra 4 years that are really meant to work on transitions from school to adulthood, whatever that might look like for the client. And which can be so beneficial, but also can sometimes look like not a lot going on. In my experience, I think the best way as a clinician I can help a family with that is to help them learn what they can advocate for and even help advocate for those things on their behalf within, scope and reason. I think kind of going back to what Dr. Nuhu said earlier about it's hard to look a professional in the face and say that they're doing something wrong. I think the same thing goes for schools sometimes. Families are in these IEP meetings with all these professionals who are telling them this is what they need to be doing, and they have this goal that's like really not specific and, maybe doesn't really make sense for the client. It's maybe based on an assessment that doesn't make sense for the client, and they end up with some transition goal that just doesn't really make sense. And I think some parents think that's the best they can get, right? That they don't feel like they have a voice to say, hey, like, I actually don't think that makes sense for my child. Like, I do not see how this would help them, in the future getting a job or living independently. Can you explain it to me, or can we determine how we can alter it to make it better? And I think us as clinicians, as much as we can within scope and reason, like, should help our families learn these skills, and as we can help advocate for them. Like, I've gone to many IEP meetings with my clients, and just to be a sounding board for parents and help with that, because sometimes it is scary and they don't know exactly they can, ask for and help and, advocate for. And I think it's important for us to help guide and teach them on how to do those things, because it doesn't come naturally. I would say it's something that you have to learn, especially with, families, maybe this is their first, child on the spectrum, or with any, developmental difference that is facing all these meetings and things. They don't know the processes like someone like us might know better.
Yeah. And I would add that when it comes to transition planning, what I've seen to be very difficult for families is that there is sometimes this mismatch between their child's or their dependent's capabilities and kind of what is available for them in the community. And I've seen that mismatch like in both directions, where there might be a lot of skill there, and there's a lot of opportunity, but then there isn't really the support from the school or from other agencies to be able to let them see that to fruition, to let them really be integrated in the community in a way that is helpful. And what is also difficult is that this is a transition, and what we know about any transition that we all go through it's just overwhelming, it's challenging, it's a difficult thing to sometimes even wrap your mind around. So while parents are doing that, then they also have to figure out this whole new way of being. You've just mastered the systems of the school, but now you have to go and master the systems of the community, and that is really, really challenging. And I haven't seen very much success in transition planning when it comes to that. And not because the plans aren't good. I've seen some really great transition plans, but the problem is the execution of them and also things falling through right when, you no longer have the support of the school or no longer have the support of the transition coordinator if your school has that. So I think that it's definitely a challenge that families at that stage experience. And I think as providers, I think really kind of pushing for starting that process a lot sooner rather than later, I think is really helpful for families. You don't want to wait until their last year to start having those conversations. This is like a conversation that you need to be having and really have a clear-cut plan A, plan B, plan C, because you're probably going to find yourself at plan C. Maybe not immediately after that transition, but at some point.
Yeah, and I can see where that could be where part of the problem is, where if you make your goal too specific and then plan A falls through, well, now your goal can't be attained anymore because it was very specific and working in this setting with this group of people or with this set of materials. So that might be where some of those goals end up. Okay, let's write it a little more broadly, but an area that we can all keep in mind. Finding the balance between a skill that can be generalized across multiple settings, but is still specific enough that it can be met. I think that's another thing, like when we're thinking about goal writing, we need to be thinking about whether the child is 2 or 22 or 32 or an adult, the adult is 32. Is this a goal that can reasonably be met? And if it's not, then we need to go back to the drawing board, help the parent, educate the parents on maybe some assessments that help break those skills down into more measurable steps. Or is there a community advocate that can help us identify how we break that skill down into something that, we talked with the client, they really want to learn this skill, but there are many, many steps to learning that skill. So how do we write these goals so that they can be broken down to meet and learn that skill? And then is it something that can be generalized across a couple different environments if the adult center plan A falls through?
I feel like it's important to have those plans as well too, because I think when thinking about working with clients in adolescence or early adult or any point, especially, but really in that early adolescence to early adulthood, when maybe they've been in school for 18, 19, up until 18, 19, 20 years old potentially, and then that school service is no longer there for whatever reason, or they age out, right? That's a huge transition for the family. So like resource wise, in terms of making transition plans, a family might say, oh, like I think that'll be feasible down the line. But then when it actually comes to it, and their child who is really reliant on them is now at home all day, it might not be as feasible as they thought it was in that moment. I think that's having all these different plans, okay, how we're gonna address these different things if this happens or if this happens is important, because I think sometimes you don't realize how difficult that change might be until it actually happens. Or not difficult, either or. It could be either side. It could be more difficult, or it could be like, oh, they're like doing great. Like, it could be either or. And so I think it's important to kind of keep that in mind when making these plans, because, having that support for, 6, 7, 8 hours a day to then not having it at all is a huge change for those families.
Yeah. Um, there, oh, go ahead, Michael.
So I was just going to say, there's a couple questions in here. I'm not sure if we want to hold on to them because you're going to get to them, do them later, but there's a couple on that transition. And like, especially like you guys have been talking about, that transition to adulthood. How do you kind of maintain family empowerment while you're making that? Because, an adult is really supposed to be independent in their own person, but you want that family empowerment. There's that. And then also, as you're talking about that transition over into the community, what should parents be looking for? Because, a lot of BCBA or ABA services end at a certain age because of insurance, and so how do you help parents make those transitions? And then there is another question I'm going to hold from Lily till later, because I think it's a bigger discussion and kind of goes off the topic of this transition, but that transition is kind of the big thing. How do you help parents with that?
Yeah. Yeah, those are great questions. And it is such a difficult time for families. So to kind of touch on how to help families transition from kind of having the support of schools, having support of certain providers, that then once it's time for them to to leave school, they're also sometimes losing their providers. I think what providers can do is help the family become kind of the case manager. And I'm not saying in a way that becomes overwhelming, but help them understand the questions to ask, help them be kind of the expert of their child's case and feel empowered as the expert of their child's case, because they're going to have to meet with new people and get new people kind of on board, get new people understanding what their child needs, what their family needs. And if they don't have that support from a provider they've been working with that has a clear understanding of their family, then they have to kind of take on that role. And it's a really complex role. I don't think it has to be super overwhelming, but if it's not organized, if the family doesn't feel like they have a good grasp on it, then it can become really difficult. So one thing that we do for our families that are kind of and I think it's Medicaid and maybe some other insurance providers that really have a hard cutoff at 21. For those families, what we really try to help do is make the primary caregiver the trainer near the end of their time in service. So what that means is, okay, let's identify another caregiver, and you're responsible for walking them through the whole behavioral intervention. You're responsible for training them on that intervention to a level where they're able to implement it. You're responsible for giving them feedback. I want to see kind of how you can become the trainer for other providers. And what that does is it makes the parent, one, feel more confident because not only can I do it, but I can teach it. And once you can teach it, there we go. That's excellent. So it helps with their confidence, but then it helps with continuation of care. So then now, as they're bringing on adult providers to work with their adult child, they're able to explain everything, train them on that, and then as they continue to develop things, now parents actually, or the caregiver has the expectation of being able to say, well, I want to know what you're doing so I can train the next person. I am the keeper of my child's or my adult child's interventions. I am the keeper of my adult child's needs. And you don't have to be the keeper forever, but I think especially during that transition period, it's really, really important, especially if your child's going to be staying in your care. If they are going to be living independently, if they're going to be living in an apartment in a way, then you can also help that individual, that adult client, be their own trainer, be their own advocate, teaching those skills so that as they go out into the world, they're able to say, this is what I need. They're starting a new job. This is what has been recommended to me by my behavioral specialist. Thank you for offering me this job. These are the accommodations I need to be successful here. Employers are going to love that. But what we need to do is start teaching them how to advocate for themselves and help the people that are caring for them also advocate for them. So I would say that the best way to help families transition is to empower them through training them how to communicate their needs to the rest of the world that they're going to be encountering. Do you guys have anything to add to that?
I was just gonna say, I think that also goes back to the importance of when you are starting off with a family, teaching them, some of those principles of what we do, like taking ABC data and things like that. Because say you have a client, they age out at 21, they're able to train other people on their interventions and it's going great. But then 5 years later, something changes. There's a big problem happening. And, I still obviously want to recommend they seek out some kind of help, whatever they can, and what's feasible and reasonable for them. But we all know that can take a long time. So in the meantime, I might not be able to, as a parent, make some crazy behavioral intervention in place, but I know how to take ABC data and I can maybe get an idea of what's going on so that they have those tools when down the line, years after services end, they can still kind of help themselves a little bit when there's not someone immediately there to help them.
Agreed. And I think that that kind of is like it feels like a subtle change in like approach, but I think it's one that is cornerstone to caregiver training. Is that you don't want to just teach them how to do the specific procedure, but you want them to understand like why that works. You want them to kind of see why that works because then they can apply that. Once you understand kind of how motivation works and how kind of, you know, reinforcement works, then you're able to apply that to many, many different situations, even if it's not the specific procedure. So then as your adult child is going off into a different setting, you're able to talk to their job coach about this is how you help them be motivated to go to work. I need someone to motivate me to go to work every day. But thinking through how to incorporate that into their framework of understanding so that they're really able to advocate for their adult child or for themselves. There was a second part to that question, or maybe a first part that we didn't answer.
Um, I can't remember. I think you answered most of it.
Okay.
One thing that came up in your answers that made me think is we're talking a lot about like parents and caregivers, but
Mhm.
what about siblings? Like, how do you get siblings, because they're the family too, kind of in this without them feeling like this is something you have to do. Like, I know there's a lot of families that say, like, the older sibling, like, you are going to take care of your brother or sister when you get older. And others are just like, nope, do what you want. So, like, how do you get the sibling kind of involved in all this? And when is the best time to start that?
Yeah. Go ahead, Karol.
I would say like immediately, kind of like with the caregivers. I have a client right now that during caregiver coaching, the little sister joins. We kind of talk through why we're doing things. She asks questions like, why are we doing that? Or like, we don't usually do it that way. And we usually just give it to her. And then I have to talk through like, well, you don't like it when she hits you for the item. So this is what we're going to do to try to like help her not do that anymore. So just kind of like explaining to them in like simple terms, like we're just trying to like help with like some of that problem behavior. I know you don't like it when she does this. So this is what we're gonna do to kind of help alleviate that. But I think like starting immediately with the caregivers is like the best time to do it.
Yeah, I would agree that providing developmentally appropriate information and requiring developmentally appropriate responsibility taking is really helpful for the child, the sibling of the child that or the adult that we are working with. What I always kind of want parents and caregivers and those in charge of the family unit to keep in mind is that the sibling is in a really complex situation, right? There's a lot of like difficult feelings happening here, and I'm not going to speak for all siblings, and all siblings don't have this experience, but there is a risk for things like resentment. There is a risk for things such as feeling as if the whole family is focused on one individual and I'm not getting the attention or the focus that I need. And we want to validate that experience because that's a really challenging place to be. If you have a sibling that requires a lot of needs, your parents only have a certain number of hours in the day, only a certain number of energy to provide to the family system, and you may be the one that doesn't get that. And that is a really challenging place to be. And it may fall onto you to take care of your sibling too. And that is also something you may want to do and something that you may be excited to do, but still may feel a little bit like a tough pill to swallow, still may feel like something isn't really fair. So we do encourage as relevant families to seek a therapeutic space for that other child to be able to express themselves, be able to learn the communication skills needed to be able to also draw boundaries for their own mental health, right? So if I have a sibling that requires a lot of needs, and I am feeling like I'm not able to get the attention I want, Wednesday, when everyone's going to therapy for that child, may not be the time to get the attention. But how do I ask for, hey, can I get a mommy and me time on Sunday when grandma's going to be home? I would like some additional time with you. Teaching the family that there's ways to incorporate time for that other child, because that's also going to boost their motivation to want to help their sibling, right? That's going to boost their willingness to kind of join in the intervention, because I do think that's really important for them to have a good understanding of why it's happening, like Karol is explaining, and then also to have certain pieces of it be something that they take ownership over, even if it is, if you're working on developing communication, or maybe working on developing social skills, like even if it is being a little bit more patient as the family plays the board game, that might be something that you ask of the sibling, and helping them understand how their ability to do that is helping, it's also helping their sibling. So we have several families that have siblings that aren't necessarily diagnosed with autism, but that are really helping in regards to whether it be social skills practicing, or whether it be a time to kind of, take a step back and give mom and dad the space to be able to implement the behavior reduction procedure. Like, ignoring the fact that the sibling is in the home is detrimental, not just for their emotional well-being, but also for the success of trying to help promote the success of the client that you're working with. Siblings are very helpful in the way that anyone learns, whether it be good or bad. But tying them in and making a conscious effort to do that is really, really important to the success of the family unit.
And I think, to piggyback on that, I think siblings offer a really nice, regardless of the age, a really nice opportunity to bring in the caregivers to be able to demonstrate those skills we talked about, teaching the caregiver to be the trainer. So that's another great opportunity where it's not necessarily the BCBA that has to be providing that support or that training to the sibling, but us as the BCBA supporting the caregiver and providing that training, and maybe even some generalization of those basics of ABA, and helping the caregiver to put together a potentially an intervention for that sibling. Or if the sibling is able to be involved in intervention, train them in again, a developmentally appropriate way to be able to implement. And then you've just incorporated so many of the things that we've talked about already into building up that family system, strengthening that caregiver, including the sibling and including the client as well.
Yeah. And I think this is a good time to kind of maybe go to Lily's question about thinking about families when there isn't really alignment in the expectations for behavior, or alignment in the behavior intervention plan. Um, and that does come up. I kind of take the same approach of what is the end goal, but the examples that I use may be very different, and depending on who's having the issue. So let's say you have grandma, and let's say you have grandpa, and grandpa is not really aligned with one of the goals, and they're looking for, well, I really need them to be speaking and having a back and forth conversation with me, and that needs to happen within, 6 months. But you're working with an individual that has great emerging language, but is not necessarily there for that. Is not yet there. The example that I would want to use with grandpa is really, one, building the rapport, getting to know him a little bit, where are his values, why is this part so important to him? And then figuring out the why of that is going to be really, really helpful. Oh, you want to feel more connection with your grandson. You want to feel that you guys are able to share a conversation and find some ways to, like, bond. You want to feel more of a close relationship. Well, let's talk about that. That's something we can accomplish within 6 months. How do we build that in? How do we build in your ability to interact with them and join them in their play? And how do we get you guys to have shared moments of joy, right? So trying to get to know the person, trying to give them examples that are relevant to their learned experience, to their experience of the world. Like, remember when you were learning this really difficult task? Well, you didn't just go from point A to point Z, right? You had to go point A to point B. Let's say grandpa's really great at making pasta, right? So you didn't just one day go and get the pasta machine and then you were excellent at making pasta. No, that's not how that happened. That's not how a skill develops. You probably read up on making pasta. You probably needed a recipe for making pasta, right? So that was not something that you were able to just, like, think on top of your head. You were guided through that process. And then it took a lot of trial and error for you to be successful. So finding examples that they can relate to, because once a person's able to put themselves in those shoes, they're able to see, oh, well, this is not just something that you can snap your fingers and have it happen. So trying to bring them in with examples that fit their understanding of the world, and then also trying to find the core of what they're really looking for. And the mix match I usually find is that they may actually have the same end goal, the same want, but different ideas of how to accomplish that. And if the goal is getting to point Z, there's many ways to do it, but we're going to talk about the most effective, most efficient way to accomplish that. And when we have those conversations, we're usually able to get everyone closer to being on the same page. Not always on the same page, but closer to it and making movement in that way. There was a question of, oh, were you gonna say something, Clarissa?
Oh, no, I was just, I was going to add too, also identifying if a caregiver is a bit of a difficult caregiver, being able to build up that rapport, even with the more difficult caregiver, in case you need to have that conversation of, this is an intervention that is effective, and perhaps if you're not willing or you're not able to participate, how can we come to an agreement altogether about not inhibiting that intervention, because that's certainly something that we've seen as well. So again, I would say building that rapport, even with that difficult caregiver, is really, really important piece.
Agreed. There's one question that we haven't gotten to that I'm gonna ask is, what are the most common misconceptions about the role of caregivers in behavioral therapy? Just to kind of give a primer for this one. So part of why we thought this would be an interesting question for us to discuss is that the caregiver role within behavioral therapy is a lot more active, I would say, than in other therapies. So I think it's important to kind of make sure those expectations are clear for families. But I'll let the team kind of jump in on what do you guys think are some of the more common misconceptions?
I would say like, yes, we require like a more active role, more of like co-therapist even. Not just like supporting and like there to like be present because we need a body in the house or in the clinic because we need the adult there, but like you're actively participating, you're implementing the interventions. I would also say maybe like we don't require like perfection. Like I don't expect you to like know what I'm talking about first caregiver coaching. We're going to repeat these things over and over and over again. I'm going to train you up. Like it's a skill, so it's going to develop. So we're not expecting like a rigid perfection in the beginning of ABA.
I think something that's often a misconception of caregivers when you're providing behavioral therapy, right, is that, maybe you're a clinician and you've gone over something with a parent 10 times and they're not getting it, right? And you're like, what's going on? Like, why aren't they doing it? And a common thing I have heard that has always really bothered me personally, but is that they are just not doing it. They don't want to do it. They're not doing this. And having kind of that attitude towards why this intervention's not being done. And I think the misconception is that the parents are just like, or caregivers, whoever it might be, are just not doing it. And I think most of the times, obviously case dependent, these caregivers care about their children, adults, whoever it might be that they're looking after. And there's probably a reason why it's not happening. And so I think not looking into the reason is a huge barrier in services. And I think that leads, and not doing that leads to a misconception that, oh, parents just don't want to do this because it takes too much time or it's just easier for them to do this. And for sure, sometimes there's sometimes situations, listen, I have a sibling with ASD and there have been times where I have definitely given in to things because I have a headache and it happens, right? But I think overall, these families want to help whoever our clients are, right? And that, not looking more into the reasons why interventions aren't happening at home leads these really negative misconceptions, I think overall are a detriment to the client and the family.
Yeah, no, I'd completely agree. Oh, Clarissa, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think to distill that down, I think the two most important things that we, rather than assuming they don't want to, is assume positive intent and seek to understand. And if we're not doing those things, then we're really not being the best BCBAs that we can be for the family system.
Agreed. And in thinking about, just to piggyback up on that, thinking about behavior, right? So it doesn't conceptually even make sense to say, oh, they just don't want to, because that's not really how behavior works. So we have to think about, well, and this is another way that social determinants of health come into this, is like, what is happening within their environment, both behaviorally, but then also the environments that they live in, the environments that they are working in, to kind of make it difficult for them to implement something that they are seeking, something that they are asking help for, but not able to do it. And like Clarissa said, really being able to, one, start with the starting point of they intend well, and then two, what are those barriers? Trying to understand what can really help them.
Sorry, one thing I was going to ask you guys based on this question is there was some data from the 90s by, I believe was the Kegels, that actually showed that including family guidance or caregiver training or whatever, you want to call it nowadays, adds stress to families. And instead of the ABA reducing stress because we're reducing behaviors, we're actually adding more stress to the families. And so how do you, or do you think about that as you're planning including families in this, in your treatment?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I'm going to start off by saying that there is stress, but that this is a situation most of the time where stress is already present within the family. And I think that when thinking about adding more stress, behavior change is a stressor. It is, you are adding something within the environment that's going to cause change, and change is difficult. And it's a lot of response effort, right? So what we are asking families to do is to, in the short term, cause themselves more stress, in the short term, have to do a lot more for the long-term outcomes that they are looking for, which is more independence for their loved one, which is more access to community settings for their loved one, which actually is the end goal that's going to cause them less stress. Because having someone that is an adult not be able to function as independently as they can is going to require a lot more effort from the family. So I think the first thing is to acknowledge that this is a stressful time, and to acknowledge the fact that this is a difficult moment for the family, and emphasize how do we help with that, with the goal not being zero, because the goal is not going to be zero when you're implementing behavioral change protocols. It's challenging, but keeping in mind that how can you tap in and out? That's another reason why having multiple caregivers is really great. Both of you shouldn't do it at the same time all the time. Maybe one person does it, the other person takes a break. And then when that person's break is over, the other person taps back in. So there's ways to kind of build in coping strategies within the family system to help them. But I think ignoring the fact that it's a stressful time, or not really helping parents prepare for it, or helping caregivers prepare for it, I think is really like the main challenge, I would say, because it's just going to show up in a later stage. You don't want to wait till the very end of your intervention development to say, okay, now I'm gonna bring you in. Well, what you've done is that you went from not being able to run, a mile to a full-on marathon. Running itself is already stressful, but when you start at a mile and then you're able to pick up skills and you're able to pick up stamina, then when you get to the end, it's not going, I mean, it's gonna be hard. I'm not saying it's not gonna be hard. Marathon is always gonna be hard, but you're better prepared for it. And then you get to the point where the person that you've been working with is at a place where they require less of their primary caregiver. And that is a place where you really, really want to be. If they don't get the intervention to get them to the place of being independent, then the level of need that they're going to have is just going to steadily increase as they age. And what that means is that the work that the primary caregiver has to do is going to increase as they go about. So my answer would be, it is a stressful time. how do we make it better with the acknowledgement that it's not going to be zero? And how do we prepare you for the ultimate goal, which is to at the at the adult stage be able to do less than you would have had to do without intervention? Is there anything you guys would add to that or say differently?
The only thing I would add to is I think thinking about like the actual meetings themselves being a stressor, I think that's where clinicians, need to work on individualizing these trainings really for their families, and that hopefully, I don't think that this would necessarily completely alleviate stress from it, but that the caregivers see value in these meetings and not just something they have to check off to continue getting services. And I think that's an easy thing to fall into as a clinician and parent. Like I probably been guilty of it myself, right? But I think making these meetings valuable to them would hopefully decrease some of that stress and that, oh, I want to meet with, my client's PCBA because I have important information to tell them, or they have important information they're going to tell me that's going to ultimately help with those long-term goals you were talking about.
And speaking about goals, I will say that that's another area in which you can try to alleviate stressors. Like, let's think about what's the most stressful thing for the family right now and develop a goal that we can target initially to help decrease their levels of stress. So for younger kids, that may be toileting, right? So it's taking me a lot of time to change the pull up all the time. Toileting would really, really help me right now. Even though communication may be a problem, maybe we focus on toileting for right now because that's going to alleviate the family stress in the short term. So thinking through, so one thing that causes families that I work with older individuals with autism is sometimes like repeated questions or kind of getting stuck on a topic or not really being able to understand when someone's not available to have a conversation. So maybe that might not be the skill that I would have picked first, but it is the one that's stressing the family system. It is the one that's making the interactions more challenging for caregivers or for siblings. So maybe that's the one that we need to address first. That's the one that we need to target to help decrease some of the stress that the families may be experiencing.
And one thing I found is a lot of families will be like, oh, well, you can come in as the BCBA, you come in and he does perfect for you, but he doesn't do that for me. Like, how do you do that? And I've always had to kind of like explain to him that, number one, I've learned how to do this. And if I can learn it, you can learn it.
Exactly.
I wasn't born knowing this. I learned this.
What? I don't believe you.
And number two, that it's okay if you can't do it at that time. If you are stressed, you had a bad day at work, take 10 minutes, have a glass of wine or a beer or whatever. It's
Yeah,
okay, to
yeah,
have a life outside of ABA,
yeah. Well, and
for them.
I think providers should plan for that, right?
Yeah.
You should not discharge your families with them implementing treatment every waking moment of the individual's life. Like that is unrealistic. There has to be some level of change where there are breaks built into everyone's day and that there is only this like programming occurring during like very like specific times. And really you should never leave an intervention in that state. And then also this is where the rapport I think is really important. I've had parents tell me it's just not happening. You know what, that multiple schedule that you guys have been really working towards, that's just not something I can do at home. And you know what? That's really important for me to know because what would be terrible is to be working towards this like program for 8 months and then they discharge and then no one's running it. And then it all falls apart. There are things that we can do, modifications that we can make, different goals that we can set to be able to have a more realistic behavior intervention plan in place for the family. So having that rapport for the family to be able to say, this is wonderful, lovely, not going to happen. And then thinking through, okay, what can we do differently? And sometimes is it a good fit? And that's also okay if it's not, but really having those honest conversations throughout their time in therapy.
Yeah, making sure that the goals, the wonderful, beautifully written goals that we came up with weren't just our own goals. Making sure to go back to your very first original point that we're including the caregivers in those goals and that our goals are in alignment.
Are there any, I think there was one question that we missed that, let me go back to, about most current intervention design focuses on childhood or early adolescence. What steps can researchers and practitioners take to create interventions that are lifelong interventions that transition seamlessly with the individual and their family as needs change from childhood to adulthood? I think that this is something that researchers do need to continue to work towards, definitely. I think that what I'm finding is that there needs to be more of a focus on the change agent, not necessarily being the primary provider. So really trying to get to a place where we're teaching caregivers, where we're teaching community providers and people that are going to be working with adults to be able to kind of fill that gap. But that is sometimes pretty challenging, because what happens in research sometimes is that the population that you are able to easily access is the one that you study the most of. And I think that when it comes to adulthood, it's not always as easy. Not that things aren't being done to help with that, but it's a pretty, I think, probably more challenging population to study, especially during that transition period where they're not necessarily all at school, that they're in different community settings and in different placements, which sometimes makes it more challenging. But it is definitely something that needs to happen.
No, I totally agree with you on that. There are a couple more questions. They're a little more specific about a specific situation, so I'm going to try to make it more general, that, for it. But as if you have an adult, autistic adult who has more aging parents, how do you kind of like support that family and to help the autistic adult get what they need when they have to spend more time helping their parents? Like if someone needs more support around, like finding an apartment or, learning how to drive, something like that, but they also have to take care of parents who are aging. Like, how do you work that into what you're doing, or do you have any suggestions on that?
Yeah, that is a difficult place to be in. I don't necessarily have direct experience with supporting a client through that, but I can provide suggestions that I think would, that I hope are helpful. Um, so I think one thing is really having a strong community and focusing on developing that for that individual, whether it be a therapist, whether it be someone who, like, if they join like an adult community setting or adult community group where they come together and discuss things. So really kind of focusing on how do I find a community to help support me during this time, because what we know about communities is that they can step in when things are challenging. If you're caring for your aging adults and you need someone to help you with transportation, or if you need someone to help you with the meal, if you have a community of friends, it may be that one of them helps, and maybe one of their caregivers steps in and helps, but really finding ways to not be isolated in your home with your aging family, I think is what I would push for. And how do we make that happen for that person? Once again, whether it be a therapist, whether it be a social worker, whether it be whether it be a lawyer, whether it be a group leader, whether it be a preacher and a mom, someone within the community that is going to kind of help them access resources and also step in as they need help. I think community building as your primary caregivers are aging is, I think, a really important thing, because they become your new foundation. They become your new guiding force. So working towards building that, I think, is what I would suggest. But I also recognize that that's really, really hard, and it's something that people struggle with across populations. It's not something that's just specific to the autism population. As you have aging family members, how do you support them while still getting your needs met? And one thing may be also talking with your aging family members about them accessing someone to support them, that maybe you're not able to do that 24/7. Maybe you're not the person that can provide that level of care. You'll be a part of it, but maybe we need to pull in other family members. Maybe we need to pull in a social worker for your family member that is aging. Maybe they need a therapist. Maybe they need specific providers to help them to kind of ease that burden. But I think all of that kind of falls under the umbrella of community building and really emphasizing the importance of doing that.
Okay, that's a good suggestion. That community, I think we all need that.
We all
To
do.
help with that. So who are some providers that you could classify as support? And do all providers see what they do as support, or do they see it as kind of, I don't know how to say it, it's like as work, like, are you just doing this because you like to support someone and help them reach their potential, or are you doing it because it's your job, type of thing? And like, how can someone kind of, especially maybe an adult, who's looking for providers, how do they kind of balance that and look for that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that yeah, that's an interesting question because I think that something can be work and still be support. Um, but I also think that it's important to have the boundary of, you know, this is work versus this is something else. So I think it depends on the scope in which that individual is working with them. So if they're working with you as an individual psychologist, where you go in for your 50-minute appointments, they're probably not the person that's going to support you with, well, ethically, they should not be the person that's supporting you with driving caregivers to an appointment. But if you're part of a group where it's a social worker, where they may actually have the capabilities within their ethical standards to be the one to help support with driving, that might make sense. So I think it depends on the provider and it depends on in which situation that they are working with you with. They may be a social worker that doesn't provide that. They may be a social worker that focuses mostly on providing resources and coaching for you to go out there and execute that. So I think it's pretty individual and really focused on the specific provider, their ethical, considerations and constraints. And yeah, so I would say you do want to have providers there, but also when thinking about community to have people step in, it's probably going to be more so peers or family members or friends within certain areas, or religious providers that are also more hands-on. But it's difficult. Like I say all this, not to say that it's something you can just like walk out your door and say, I'm ready to find a provider that's going to help me. Because I think it's really, really challenging. I don't want to minimize that. These are suggestions, but I know that in practice, finding that, especially for adults, is just really, really challenging.
And I will say, I feel like I've noticed in our field, just, anecdotally, as the number of BCBAs and ABA companies and RBTs explodes, and we kind of have to work within each other to find our niche. I feel like I've noticed more colleagues building out, okay, I'm going to be a BCBA and I'm going to provide early intervention services. Sure, that makes sense. I'm a BCBA and I'm going to provide complex behavior support services. That makes sense. But I've also seen some BCBAs who are realizing that need in the community, and we're basically just starting to find where we need to be in the community, and then what other, if we shouldn't provide those services ethically as BCBAs, what other degrees or certifications do we need to access ourselves to provide and fill that need in the community? Like, are we actually seeing there's a lot of need of behavior professionals who provide respite care, or anyway, just various things like that. But I'm interested to see our field sort of begin to expand and personalize, I guess, to where we see that need. Because I mean, I know we've seen it in our own practice, like our caregivers looking at those social determinants of health. Right now, there's nobody else to provide that. So we're going to find a way to ethically provide that so that our clients can get the services they need to reduce the stress and to get caregivers trained and to make caregivers better advocates. So we're definitely in a very interesting area, a time of flux, as we figure out what those supports are, and are we the providers that are going to be those supports, or do we need to help our caregivers or our clients find the supports outside of us, like you mentioned?
And I think it's important, one of the things you said about like caregivers being advocates, because really everything that really the behavior field has now, and because we are so expanding, is because of parents. And it wasn't a BCBA that pushed to get insurance coverage for it. It
Yeah.
was a parent. It wasn't a BCBA who pushed to get special education laws. It was parents, and really helping them know that they're the reason we're here, type
Mhm.
of thing, I think is important, and teaching those advocacy skills. And that's something we keep like talking about having as a program, is how do you teach advocacy skills from little all the way up, and then self-advocacy skills as well,
Yeah.
because we're here because of parents. I
Agreed.
think a lot of professionals forget that.
Agreed.
Exactly.
It's very, very important. They are very powerful, and I think that sometimes don't feel that way, but helping them kind of gain that confidence and understanding, I think is important.
Okay,
Well,
it doesn't look like there's other questions, unless you guys have anything you want to say to wrap up, or any kind of last point you want to make before we sign off, or
I think the only thing I would say, which is not new, I think that just ending on the note that it's teamwork, I think that really produces the best outcomes. And if we're able to take that approach with families, I think that we are a lot more successful in reaching everyone's goals, including our own, which is to help the families that we serve. And that's all I got. Well, I hope that's all we got. Anyone else want to throw anything out there?
thank you all. It was great information. Everyone seems to really enjoy the great insight you had into
Thank you
this.
guys for having us.
Okay, yeah. Have a
Bye-bye.
good night.